Imagine a world where one person holds all the power, a king who can take your land, your money, your freedom, all on a whim. A world with no rules to protect you, no justice to defend you. This wasn't a fantasy. This was England in the early 13th century. But then, a single document, a piece of parchment and ink, appeared and planted the seeds of a revolution that would redefine power forever. This is the incredible and surprisingly messy story of the Magna Carta. Our story begins with a king who, to put it mildly, was not very popular. King John. If you were casting a villain for a medieval blockbuster, John would be a top contender. He inherited the throne from his legendary brother, Richard the Lionheart, but he lacked Richard's military prowess and charisma. Instead, John became known for his greed, his ruthlessness, and a string of spectacular failures. He lost vast and valuable territories in France, earning him the humiliating nickname John Softword. To fund his failed wars and lavish lifestyle, he squeezed every last penny from his kingdom. He imposed crushing taxes on his barons, the powerful nobles who controlled much of the land and wealth. He sold off church offices, seized property, and demanded exorbitant fees for royal justice, which often meant no justice at all. If you crossed the king, you could find yourself imprisoned without trial, your lands confiscated, your family held hostage. The law was whatever King John said it was on any given day. There was no accountability, no limit to his power. The entire kingdom groaned under the weight of his tyranny. The barons, the most powerful men in England after the king, were at their breaking point. These weren't just disgruntled citizens. They were warriors, lords of vast estates with their own armies. For years, they had tolerated John's demands, but his endless failures and escalating cruelty became too much to bear. They saw their fortunes dwindling, their rights eroding, and their lives hanging by the fragile thread of the king's mood. They were tired of paying for his lost wars. They were tired of his arbitrary punishments. They realized that under King John, no one was safe. So, in early 1215, they did something radical. They renounced their oaths of loyalty to the king. This was an act of open rebellion, a declaration of civil war. Led by figures like Robert Fitzwalter, they organized their forces and created a list of demands, a charter of liberties they wanted the king to guarantee. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for a principle, the idea that even a king should be bound by the law of the land. The rebels marched on London, and the city, fed up with John's rule, threw open its gates to them in May 1215. This was a massive blow to the king. With the capital city lost and many of his most powerful nobles against him, John's position was incredibly weak. He was outmaneuvered and outnumbered. He had no choice but to negotiate. This brings us to a water meadow on the banks of the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. On June 15, 1215, a tense meeting took place. On one side, King John, cornered and furious. On the other, the determined, armed barons. Here, amidst the English countryside, history was made. John was forced to affix his royal seal to the document the barons had prepared, the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. What did this document actually say? It wasn't a grand declaration of universal human rights as we might think of it today. Much of it dealt with specific feudal grievances, things like inheritance taxes and fishing rights, but buried within its 63 clauses were revolutionary ideas that would echo through the centuries. Clause 39 is the most famous. It declared, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." Think about that. For the first time, it was written down that the king could just throw someone in jail or take their property without a proper legal process. This was the birth of due process, the right to a fair trial. Another key clause, Clause 12, stated that the king could not levy new taxes without the general consent of the realm. This planted the seed of the idea of no taxation without representation, a concept that would fuel revolutions centuries later. The Magna Carta essentially established a fundamental principle. The king was not above the law. The law was a power in itself, and even the monarch had to obey it. This was a radical departure from the idea of the divine right of kings, where the ruler's power was seen as absolute and God-given. So, King John signed the charter, the barons celebrated, and everyone lived happily ever after. Right? Absolutely not. This is where the story gets messy. John had no intention of honoring the agreement, yet signed it under duress, and as soon as the barons dispersed, he went straight to the most powerful man in Europe, the Pope. John argued that the charter was illegal, forced upon him against his will. The Pope, a political ally of John's, agreed. He declared the Magna Carta null and void just 10 weeks after it was created. The deal was off. England plunged back into a brutal civil war, known as the First Barons' War. The rebel barons were so desperate that they offered the English crown to a French prince, Louis, who then invaded England. The country was in chaos. The Magna Carta, the great document of peace and justice, had failed. It seemed destined to be a forgotten footnote in a long and bloody conflict. But then, fate intervened. In October 1216, in the middle of the war, King John suddenly fell ill and died. Just like that, the tyrant was gone. His son, Henry III, was only 9 years old. The advisors to the young king were clever. They realized they needed to win back the support of the rebel barons and unite the country against the French invaders. And what better way to do that than to bring back the very document the barons had fought for? So, in 1216, and again in 1217, and most definitively in 1225, the Magna Carta was reissued. It was edited, with some of the more radical clauses removed, but its core principles remained. By reissuing it voluntarily, the new king showed that he intended to rule by the law. It became a symbol of good government and a peace treaty that helped end the Civil War. It was this reissued version of 1225 that officially entered English law. Over the next few centuries, the Magna Carta's journey continued. It wasn't always respected. Powerful kings often ignored it, but it was never forgotten. Every time a king overstepped his authority, people would point back to the Magna Carta. It became a rallying cry for liberty, a tool used by Parliament to limit the power of the monarch. Lawyers and jurists like Sir Edward Coke in the 17th century revived it, using it as a weapon against the Stuart kings and their claims to absolute power. The influence of the Magna Carta then jumped across the Atlantic. When the American colonists felt their rights were being violated by the British Crown, what document did they look to for inspiration? The Magna Carta. Its principles of due process, trial by jury, and protection from arbitrary power are woven directly into the fabric of the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The idea that a government's power should be limited and that citizens have fundamental rights can be traced right back to that meadow at Runnymede. Today, its legacy is global. It has inspired constitutions and human rights declarations all around the world. From the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to countless national legal systems, it stands as a universal symbol for the fight against oppression. It's amazing, isn't it? A document born from a medieval power struggle between a greedy king and a group of self-interested barons. A document that failed almost immediately, somehow became one of the most important legal documents in the history of the world. It reminds us that progress is rarely a straight line. It's often messy, with setbacks and failures, but a powerful idea. The idea that no one, not even a king, is above the law, can survive, evolve, and ultimately change the world. The story of the Magna Carta is the story of a seed of freedom, planted in a moment of crisis, that grew into a mighty tree whose branches now shelter us all. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what piece of history you'd like to explore next. See you in the next video.